Hello, I'm the Grubstlodger, and welcome to December. It's gloomy. I think you could probably see it in the lighting in this room, in the pale mankness of my face. But my voice is still good. I'm going to do a traditional December, but what about episode soon. And traditionally, I've always had a horrible throat cold during those, so we'll see how they are. If you listen to the one about Rookwood, you really hear the gruff bass coming out there. But we're not talking about December, we are talking about November's books, and they were very up and down, I have to say. Very, very up and down. So I started the month with this book here, Under the Net by Murdoch. I'd been a bit unsure about her because I heard she won the Booker, and though that doesn't mean I will necessarily not like it. You know, I enjoyed Testaments and I love Penelope Fitzgerald, and she won once and was up for it a couple of times. It does mean I'm wary. I've read a lot of Booker and Booker nominations that didn't quite do it for me, and I heard she was serious. And before she was a novelist, she was a philosopher, and particularly a continental philosopher, engaged in that tradition, and I can't stand continental philosophy. So I was unsure, but I liked the blurb. So I went with it. And you know what? I love everything in this book, except the story. I love the characters. The main character, he's called Jake. I did remember it right, but I just checked. He's called Jake, and he is a lazy writer. He kips on people's sofas. He seems to think it's his right to just rock up and have other people look after him. And when he's kicked out of One More House, he goes on a series of improbable journeys around London. And the way London is described, and the way the improbable journeys are improbable, but in such a way as you could almost imagine them happening in London. He kidnaps a famous screen dog. He gets in a fight in a film studio on a Roman set. He swims in the Thames. There's this brilliant bit, which is the most London-y bit. I can imagine this in Shoreditch. He goes to a mime theatre, and everything's silent, and it's just atrocious and embarrassing, and I loved it. All of the scenes are great. The tone is wonderful. The writing's really good. Even the philosophy element is not wanky. But it doesn't cohere into anything. Each scene just sort of falls into the next scene. It's just accumulation of scenes, and as good as each scene is, it doesn't, for me, accumulate into a novel. So I loved it, and also was unimpressed with it. Every moment was fantastic, but the moments did not string along and build up and create a proper novel for me. I might have another go at an Iris Murdoch one day. I liked her tone, I liked her thoughts, I liked her characters, I loved the weird situations and the way they were described. The swimming in the Thames was almost numinous. It was sparkling, it was beautiful, and why they did it, because they felt like it. What they did next, got dried, went to a shop. It just didn't cohere as a full novel for me, but good scenes. So yeah, I'm really torn in two about this book. The next book of the month was Fools and Jesters at the English Court by John Southworth. I've just recorded talking about this, but my sister phoned me up while I was doing it. Here's a clip. And I'm glad she did, because she interrupted a 2-minute long rant about lampposts when I'm walking home from work. They will turn on. And it's beautifully bright for about 2 seconds, and then because they're energy-saving LED ones, they don't actually light as far as down to the ground. And if there are trees near them, then my road's almost pitch black. The point about lampposts was I suddenly get this thing where I think, I don't know anything about such and such. At one point it was lampposts. This time it was fools. They're in literature, but did they really exist? How did they exist? What kind of people were they? And this is a really good book if you want to know about fools. It does exactly what I want a specific non-fiction book to do. It told me just a little bit more than I was prepared to find out. I like that. Just slightly full up. It takes English fools, and it's historical. It doesn't really talk so much about the sociological stuff. And we learn lots of interesting anecdotes. I particularly like Geoffrey, who is a proportionate dwarf. He was the fool to the wife of King Charles I. And during the English Civil War, he actually became a cavalry captain. And he later got exiled because he fought a duel and won, which is brilliant. And then he got captured by Barbary pirates and was a slave for 7 years and then escaped. It's a really good story. I've actually got a book about his story. I'm pointing that way because it's on a shelf up there. There are lots of other interesting people, but a little like The Hermit in the Garden, which is all about ornamental hermits, but was mostly about ornamental hermitages, particularly the lamb knucklebone flooring. This book was a little bit too much about the clothing. There's a reason for this. The best records from the court that relate to fools are the fools' expenses, specifically their clothing. And we find out a lot about how they were dressed, often not like that. There were fools that dressed like that, but most often not. In fact, a lot of them wore quite normal, hard-wearing clothes. I followed up that book by another book about fools, Sandra, Billington, A Social History of the Fool, because I wanted a broader look, and this is more about the sociology and the meaning of fool in time. It ends up being really, really dense. And it's all about the word fool and how the word fool changes and how there are different kinds of fool. There are Jack Puddings and Merry Andrews and clowns, and a clown is not a fool, and a fool is not a punchinello, and a punchinello is not a panettone, which I know is a Christmas cake. But it gets so tied up in linguistic denseness that I have to say, for a lot of this book, I wasn't completely sure what was going on. And the back half is all about Morris dancing, because there's a position of a ritual fool in various Morrises. And by the way, not all Morris dancing is Morris dancing. Some of it is grouncing, some of it is this, some of it is that. So again, linguistic. You get tied up in language for the most part in this. It gave me horrible flashbacks to studying philosophy. Yeah. Which is not to say it's a bad book. It's a very good book at what it does. It's just what it did was not particularly what I wanted. I did learn something really interesting though about the mountebank, or mountebank. I've seen it done twice. Like the travelling salesman who comes and sells his wares. If you've seen Pete's Dragon, the baddie's one of those because he wants to chop up the dragon and make medicine with it. And the thing that book says is that the mountebank didn't really sell potions and cures, or if they did, they were bought as a side product. What they actually did was entertain. They came on, they did their patter with their Merry Andrew, who was the kind of their assistant, their stooge, and people paid for the entertainment of the patter. And a lot of the patter was topical, so it also spread news and satirical jokes and sort of that kind of thing. And so people would buy the medicine as a way of supporting the person for the services to satire and to news and to comedy. And I found that very interesting. Yeah, so I didn't particularly enjoy it, but that's not because it was a bad book. The next book I read was Impromptu in Moribundia. Weird title. It's by Patrick Hamilton, who I absolutely adore. Patrick Hamilton writes a great deal of booze-soaked London depressing stories. Occasionally he goes to Brighton, but he's equally depressing there. If you've read Hungover Square, or the Gorse trilogy, or 20,000 Streets Under the Sky, which is one of my favourites. My favourite of his is called Slaves of Solitude, and that's about a woman who lives in a horribly repressive shared house, essentially, and everyone is horrible. And she just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and then she comes into her own. And it's a really good book. This is absolutely nothing like any of his other work. This is a sort of Swiftian, I suppose, Gulliver's Travels kind of thing. A man goes through a thing called the Astro Radio, and that shoots him off to the other end of the galaxy, where he goes to Moribundia. I guess he's Impromptu. He goes to Moribundia, and he has to fit in. And what Moribundia is the ideal version of England in the 1920s-ish. And it's the ideal version of England as portrayed by newspapers. So every Cockney is a cheerful chappie who has a bit of a joke and speaks in incomprehensible Cockney language. Every posh person is tall, erect, and every cricket match comes down to the wire and you have to play up and play the game. Every spinster looks the same. Diseases have real effects. So if you suffer from indigestion, you actually have devils poking you in the stomach, for example. Or if your nose is leaking because you've got a cold, it turns into a physical tap and drips. And everything's inspired by adverts. It's not just the world according to newspaper, it's the world according to newspaper adverts. And so the people start saying things from the adverts. So they'll be having a conversation and somebody will go, I feel rather poorly. And they'll go, oh, really? Well, why don't you try new anti-fart pills? These will make you feel better. And as they do that, words come out in a bubble to look like the print adverts of the day. People can't help doing this. And they share this advert behaviour all the way through. And I did get the feeling that the guy who wrote the original Roger Rabbit book, it's called Who Censored Roger Rabbit, might have read this, because in that the Roger Rabbit is not a moving cartoon, he's a strip cartoon, and all the strip cartoons have bubbles, but there the bubbles fall on the floor and they form this detritus, so you know where there's been lots of tunes because there's just all these word bubbles decomposing on the floor. Actually, this was surprisingly entertaining. I thought it was going to be a bit flat. Someone taking the piss out of a world that doesn't particularly exist anymore, but it so does exist. In fact, I think the world is more like this than the time it was taking the piss out of. People really do speak in advert speak now, and really do live lives for others, sort of through media and things, in a way that wasn't quite as true when this was written. At the same time, there's only so much growth and depth you can get out of a purposely paper-thin world. And so, very enjoyable, but I'm glad it wasn't longer than that. But yeah, Patrick Hamilton, surprising in different contexts, like that. Now, next book I read was this. I actually won this book last year. I got it signed and stuff because I won a, was it Samuel Johnson or someone else phrase competition. And this Tuesday I'm going to go and see Henry Hitchings. He's coming to the book group where we're going to discuss this book. It's called The World in 38 Chapters, or Dr. Johnson's Guide to Life. And I talked about Dr. Johnson in context, I think, last month or the month before. And that was a serious academic look at him through lots of different contexts. This is a popular book. If you don't know much about Samuel Johnson and anything I've ever said about him slightly interests you, this is a good place to start, because it's a biography that is also a self-help book. So each chapter tells you a little bit about him, or about his writing, or about his views, and then it relates it to the real world and how his forthrightness could help us, or his unflinching look at the world's sadness as well as its happiness, but also the joy and the jokes that Samuel Johnson has. And it's really, really good. It goes through his life in order. You get a pretty decent biography, but you get a really decent way of appreciating who Samuel Johnson was and why he deserves to have a place in the modern world, which I'm completely up for. The other thing I love about Henry Hitchings is that he focuses way more on what Samuel Johnson actually wrote than about the things he was reported to have said. And I think that even amongst Johnson fans, he's not read enough for himself, and Johnson is great. So, love this book. There was a downside though. I tell you, this month, quite a few downsides. The downside of this book, though, is that it was too perfect. That sounds weird. But this is exactly the kind of book I would have written. Well, almost not exactly the kind of book. This is almost exactly the book I would have written had I written a book about Samuel Johnson. And so, it didn't surprise me at all. Like, I read it through it, agreeing with it the whole way. It was a bit like when you see a comedian and they say something and the audience will clap and go, yeah, that's very true. But they don't laugh. It was a bit like that. I went through the whole book going, yeah, I agree with you. But because I agreed with him, we couldn't have a conversation. And that's one of the joys in reading, is having a conversation with the author. Like, I didn't enjoy this book. But we could have a chat about, oh, that's what you're trying to do with it. Okay, that's not what I want from it. But fine, you're doing that. Cool. This, we was too much on the same page. It'd be interesting to see what happens when we have a discussion with him and the rest of the group on Tuesday, which I'll be writing up on the blog, because I always do. Now, the last book I read in November was Ben-Hur, Backstory. When I was little, I had lots of small abridgments. They were fat, printed on very cheap yellow paper, about 150 pages each, but very, very small, about 50 words a page. And one of my favourites was the Ben-Hur one, and I reread it, and I reread it, and I reread it. And so this copy here is one of the earliest classics I ever bought. As you can see, it's a Wordsworth classic, which I don't buy anymore because I want all the textual support. And it's weird when you buy classics. You don't know whether you're getting the real deal. I tend to buy an Oxford or a Penguin because I feel comfortable, and I don't feel as comfortable with the Wordsworth. Especially now they've redesigned the covers. New Wordsworth covers are awful. But this one's pretty decent actually, because it's the old Wordsworth. So I got this when I was about 13, maybe even younger, maybe even like 10, 11. And I stopped after about 4 pages, because my abridged edition starts with Ben-Hur and Masala, who still sounds like a curry to me, arguing, and then the climactic scene when the tile falls off and nearly hits the governor, and then the whole plot is set in motion. This starts with 50 pages of the wise men meeting up and going to see the birth of Jesus. Then we get the rest of it. I mean, talk about prologues that don't... I mean, yes, it's about Jesus. It's called Tale of a Christ as a subtitle. And by the end, he converts to Christianity. But at the beginning of the book, there's a good video I watched which said that the prologues need to help you with the information you need for the beginning of the book. And for the beginning of the book, 50 pages about the Nativity, it's not needed. What's more, this is really, really badly written. Really badly written. He's trying to go for biblical and grand. And so for him, naturally, he goes for, King James Bible. Because that is in English, the sound of the Bible, especially when he wrote this. God, King James is the most awful sounding thing ever. It's so stiff and awkward. And just a note there, what I said was not God King James Bible, I said Cod King James Bible, as in cod reggae, or badly appropriated or badly done versions of it. Thank you. This comes out especially in the dialogue. Most of the King Jamesy stuff's the dialogue, and everyone's going thee and thou, word thou, that. So tense conversations are not tense; they're just stodgy and awful, and it's just horrible. Also, Lew Wallace, who wrote this, did an awful lot of research. He even visited the area, but mainly he got maps and pictures and accounts and read histories, and in writing this he became a Christian from an agnostic. But he doesn't meld the research into the story. So you'll get a huge slab of, here is a list of geographical things. Here is a list of other things. Oh, and here is some dialogue in really crap King James-esque language. And you're like, oh, God. Oh. I mean, he's got a good story in there. I mean, the film's brilliant. It's 60 years since the film. It was kind of what led me to read it. And in fact, the story is better in this. The character of Amyara is really good. And the Egyptian, who is this, she's the wise man's daughter, but she's a total nasty piece of work. And that was all brilliant too, but, it's just horribly, horribly written. And then he's got all these sort of bad fan fiction writer qualities. So every character comes in, even if you met them before, and you've got to have a full description of them, but it doesn't tell you anything about them. It tells you about their clothing at great detail. But seeing as almost every character in this book wears what is essentially a white sheet, and then everyone's handsome, and sometimes you think he's leching on Ben-Hur, and he's kind of feeling aroused by his muscly male protagonist. I don't mind, that's cool, but outright leching on your fictional character just seems a bit weird, especially when you're trying to dress it up in King James language. It just, no, it's awful. Really, really, really bad. Worst thing I've read this year. And that's how I ended the month. Hope December's better. See ya.